Bonsoir, Mesdames, Messieurs. Bienvenue à l'Université Concordia. Hi, I'm Graham Carr. I'm the Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies here at the university. It's truly great to see so many people this evening for this year's second Thinking Out Loud event. And I want to first of all thank the Concordia Alumni Association and the Globe and Mail for their generous support of this series. Now, for those of you who are here for the first time, let me tell you just a little bit about the purpose of Thinking Out Loud. Thinking Out Loud is really designed as a series of stimulating conversations on topics that we think matter to contemporary society. It's partly about how we can connect the research that we do at Concordia with issues of interest to the public, but it's also about creating a format that allows us to get beyond sound bites and cliches and have an actual conversation. And tonight, we're going to have a conversation about games, about ethics, and about how we connect as human beings with each other. So without further ado, let's get started. Please join me in welcoming tonight's moderator from the Globe and Mail, André Picard. Hi, André. And of course, our conversationalists for this evening, Professor Mia Consalvo from the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia, and author Clive Thompson. Please welcome them and enjoy the evening.
Great, thank you, Graham, and welcome everyone. Bienvenue ce soir. So we know that video games are really popular, they're really ubiquitous in our lives. But you know, how are they changing culture? How are they changing the way we interact? How are they changing society? That's some of the big issues we want to tackle tonight. So we have two fabulous panelists to talk about it, and then we have one Luddite moderator. And they've been educating me all afternoon on some of the jargon, but I'll probably get lost in it a bit. But I'm going to start with some very basic, Clive called them Socratic naive questions of someone who doesn't know gaming very well, and then we'll get into a little more depth. And in a little while, before we wrap up, about 15, 20 minutes before we wrap up, we're going to invite you to join in the conversation. There's two mics, and we'll invite you to come up there and ask questions that you have for our panelists. And there'll be a book signing afterwards if you're interested in books as well. So let me start, Mia, with really a very basic question. I want to get a sense of who are gamers? You've done a lot of research. Who are they? Why do they do it?
Sure.
Really basic stuff.
Well, more and more people play games, so every year I kind of have to update that answer, but you know, more than half of Canadians and Americans play games, and then it totally breaks down depending on where you play them. If you're playing on a console or on your phone, you know, there are spaces now where you know, women play more social games than men do. I've talked with 70-year-old women who've spent hundreds of dollars on online games. Kids certainly play. I think now adult women actually play more often than teen boys do. And so it's becoming just more of a commonplace activity. People play at home in front of the TV. They play on the bus or on the metro. You know, they play on their iPad. And so it's becoming just not just something that people do like at night or on the weekend for fun, but as a way to kill time, as a way to do something with their friends. You know, people play for lots of reasons.
But is it socioeconomic? Is it richer people? Does everybody play regardless? Can some people not afford to play?
There are, well, now you see games that are range from like your $60 or $70 new console release, like Rise of the Tomb Raider, to free-to-play games. And you know, there's an argument about with those free-to-play, and you know, do you need to really spend stuff in them to win? But a lot of them you can actually play without ever having spent a dime. I know because I do that. And so you have a range of them, and also just with consoles, even though newer consoles may cost more money, there's actually quite a lot of people who play like on older systems like an Xbox 360 or even a PlayStation 2. And so even across like the economic spectrum, you see people playing.
And Clive, there's a bit of a stereotype about gamers, especially older people like myself. In the media, there's a lot of stereotypes that it's all these, you know, young white boys who are hiding away in their basements dressed in black. Are those stereotypes, any truth to them, or are they just nonsense? No.
Well, there's not no truth to them. I mean, I've known some of these sort of, you know, a stereotypical, you know, in the basement, unexposed to sunlight, surrounded by empty pizza box gamers. I've been that gamer occasionally. But but it is true what Mia said, like the range of people who play games has expanded dramatically in the last 10 years, and the range of types of games have expanded so much that, when I first started writing about video games 15 years ago, you could ask someone, do you like to play video games? And it was assumed that meant kind of a game where you're running around and shooting someone, or maybe a game where you were playing like Civilization, trying to. And now there's so many different types of games that asking whether or not you like video games is sort of like asking someone, do you read prose? And like, well, what do you mean? Do you mean the back of cereal boxes? Do you mean, Jonathan Franzen's Freedom? Do you mean plays? There's so many different styles of games, that gamer as a word becomes kind of hard to define. Does it mean that image you have in your head of someone spending a long time alone with like a first-person shooter, or is it someone who just pulls out their phone 4 or 5 times a day to sort of play a bit of Angry Birds or something like that, almost as like a mental sort of palate cleanser? All those things are in that umbrella now.
But through history, we've always played games. We've played card games, dice games, street hockey, there's games of all sorts.
Yeah.
What's different about the electronic versions of games? Are they just an evolution, or are they something completely different?
Do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll
All
start.
right, go for it.
Well, I think one way they can be different is there are many more electronic games that you can play by yourself. And so, like, if you think about card games, there's solitaire. Other than that, you need other people to play. There are a lot more video games where you can play on your own. It quickly becomes the case, though, that you're actually playing with your friends, even in a single-player game, or you're talking about it. But it does offer those types of opportunities. But it's interesting, too, to think, there is a lot that these games share in common: board games, card games, party games, electronic games. People play them for many of the same reasons.
And Clive, what?
You're right. There's games. If you think about what is a game, so a game is really any time that you sit down and you set up a bunch of kind of seemingly arbitrary rules that make it difficult to achieve a goal, but make it fun when you can actually achieve that goal because you somehow work past these crazy rules. And so that goes for backgammon, it goes for hockey, it goes for anything, and it goes for a game that you play, a video game. Like basketball. If you take away the rule that you have to be dribbling while you move, suddenly the game is broken, right? The rules are what make the games. And what we like about games is getting any system where we have to figure out how those rules interact. And so one of the joys of watching sports is watching people, athletes, try and figure out how to do something new and crazy and within these constraints, these rules. So what's really interesting about video games is that it's one of the first times we've seen, really, in human civilization where you get a lot of new games being designed. Because one of the problems, in a weird way, about physical sports is that we don't invent them anymore, right? Like, we've got like 7 or 8 sports we play a lot in school, and that's it. The door's shut. We don't make them anymore. Video games are where you continually see someone saying, I've got a new bouquet of weird rules that you're going to have to figure out and master. And there's something joyful about doing that. And I think that's one of the reasons they've become so popular.
But you can do all kinds of things virtually that you can't do in real life easily. You can kill people, you can build buildings, you can create civilizations. It's much richer than traditional games, right?
Well, in one sense, but I grew up playing D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, and even though I didn't have a screen showing me those characters, I was playing with friends, and we were role-playing all of those things, and so, we had that available to us as a way to do things that we couldn't do in daily life.
Yeah, I think I disagree with what you're saying because it's part of the, in media there's this immersion fallacy that like the more realistic something is, the more immersive it somehow is. And that's simply not even vaguely true, because if that were true, then, I don't know, a TV show would be more immersive than a novel, which it clearly isn't. There are different types of immersion. And we saw this. We saw this with the evolution of video games because, so they start in the mass way in the 1980s with these kind of very pixelated, like Pac-Man and Space Invaders, and then in the 90s they started to get kind of more realistic, 3D and whatnot. And there was this period when people thought that if they just got more and more and more realistic, eventually they'd be just like reality, and that would be the moment when video games were the most amazing. And it turned out not to be even slightly true, because in the same way that artistic realism grew from like the medieval period up to like the 18th century, 19th century, where there's this zeal to do unbelievably realistic paintings, where it looks exactly like it is, and they sort of hit the end point of that, and they began to realize, Picasso and the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, like, no, actually revisioning and re-seeing reality in a weird way is more interesting. The same type of thing happened to games. They got really realistic, and they realized, well, this doesn't actually improve immersion.
It also got kind of creepy.
And they got kind of creepy, that's right, yeah, the uncanny valley.
Right.
Yeah.
And is you said that my premise before wasn't true, but is the opposite true? Does it prevent us from being more imaginative because everything's there and visual? It's not like Dungeons and Dragons. You don't have to imagine things. They're there. You can create them.
But people, like with, I used to study The Sims, the game, the first version, and it's a game where you can run your Sims' lives, you can kill them, you can build houses, you can do all sorts of things, and players loved the game, but they also weren't satisfied with the game as it was, and there was this incredible modding culture around it to build things, for the game. And so people weren't just envisioning the game and its possibilities, but what they could bring to it. They could design fashions, they could build things, and then they have these little dramas that they would set up for their Sims and take screenshots and put them together in scrapbooks and tell narratives, or like Clive and I were talking about, they'd build all these houses, and so they can be like these these bases from which people can imagine even more things.
So what is that? Is that just mindless entertainment? Is it learning? What is it?
I guess if we say it's mindless entertainment, we can go home now, right?
Not necessarily.
I mean, some of it is, some of it is just fun to collect things or to shoot things or to do whatever it is that you get to do in the game. And some of it is you are learning things. Like lots of games offer you these challenging situations, and you have to figure out the right strategy. You have to solve the puzzle. In some games, you're actually building things. So you're building these mods or these add-ons. So I think there are lots of different opportunities.
I've wondered about this mindless energy. I mean, because I've spent so many hours, playing video games. In fact, there's this. You play a lot of games. There's this thing where you type in the command's called time played, and this occasionally strikes horror into the hearts of video game players. It tells you how long you've been playing the game for. And I've typed that in sometimes. It's like 87 hours. I mean, I could. And I think on what I could have done with that time, right? I mean, I could have, learned a new language or something like that.
Yeah. But you would have been on Facebook anyway.
Yeah, right? I would have been on Facebook, right, watching TV. So it's partly I sometimes kick myself for having played so much because I think this is just mindless entertainment. But there's other times when I think, there's something really deeply philosophic going on with why we like games. There's a great book that came out about a year ago. About it's just for Jewel. It's The Art of Failure, is it called? The Art of Failure. And he basically asks, why do we play, like, the default state in a video game is failing. I mean, you start playing a game, you do something, it doesn't work. And then you do it over again, and it doesn't work. And it's just this constant hammering your head against this wall until finally you sort of get slightly through. And he asks the question, which is an interesting one, which I hadn't thought of, why do we willingly, as a pastime, pick something that we're going to fail at catastrophically over and over and over and over and over again? What do we find interesting about that? And he has a bunch of reasons for thinking about it, but it has to do with thinking about human limits, thinking about human will. It provides a really interesting stage on which to experience life in a different way.
Mm-hmm. And I'd add there's nothing wrong with play and mindless entertainment. I mean, we have this sense that you're supposed to play when you're a kid, and then you grow up and you're serious. And if you play games at all, you have to find these reasons to justify it, like I'm bettering my hand-eye coordination or this or that. I mean, adults can play too, and that should be part of why we enjoy games.
And play is good, play is relaxing, but what about inactive play? You hear a lot of talk about, well, kids are just sitting in front of video games, that's why they're getting fat. It's actually because of what they eat, but it's beside the point. But what about that? Are there downsides to this? And we don't have to talk about 87 hours at a time, but are there downsides to playing too much?
Well, there are situations, and I've talked with players who've said they got so wrapped up in a game. Often this was an MMO where they spent so much time in that they realized it was problematic, and like their grades were suffering or their relationships with their family was suffering, and like they told us, like their group, this is a way of saying like I need to step away from it right now. I think the thing that's key, though, is that it's not that people go into these spaces as perfectly adjusted, problem-free individuals and then get corrupted by the game. I think we're using these spaces because maybe there's something we don't want to deal with, there's something going wrong, and it becomes a way to, not deal with that. And some people can use it in a way that, is healthy for a certain period of time. Other people can get caught up and lost in it because, the other things are so painful to deal with for them. I don't know, you probably talked with other people.
And just a small aside, what's an MMO? Because as a journalist,
Sure.
I don't like acronyms.
An MMO is a massively multiplayer online game, like
see
World
why
of
it's
Warcraft.
MMO now, okay.
Yeah.
Clive, sorry.
Yeah, I definitely think, this question of like sort of spending much time sitting on your butt and not going outdoors is significant with young people. I think that games in a way are related to the problem but not the cause of the problem. So Dana Boyd, a researcher, she's talked to thousands of kids about social media and their interaction with computers, wrote a great book called It's Complicated. And her central chapter in the middle basically says, she takes a look at the reason, at the way in which children's lives have been conscripted, such that because society's become more fearful, parents are more fearful, they don't allow kids to wander around as much as they used to, quite dramatically so. And that has become one of the really big problems. They're inside the house all the time, and they're not allowed to just go out and around. And so they flocked onto social media, partly because it was a place they could go to that was relatively free of adults, and they go to video games for partly that reason too. But as Mia said, video games are additionally, they're a challenging thing to wrestle with because they're designed to try and give you that system where it is hard to get to your goal, and when you can finally do it, it is just thrilling. That is a very compelling thing. The rest of our lives don't give us that very often, right? People like these games because they offer us experiences that don't come in everyday life, and that's hard to step away from. I've handed in stories horribly late because I was playing my 700th version of Burnout Revenge.
Yeah. It can also be a place where it feels like people are relying on you. So
Yes.
it's not just that you're trying to
yes.
achieve this goal, but if it's a multiplayer game and you're playing this key role, and so it's not just that you need to step away to do something, but you don't want to let your team down.
Yeah, team play. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about that, this notion that, I talked about it at the outset, that we feel it's all individuals hiding away, but the reality is more and more that it's a community, right? This is different communities build. What about the social aspect of gaming? That's quite important.
Yes.
Good answer. Good answer. Okay.
Whenever I talk to people about their gameplay, even if they're playing it by themselves, they're usually part of some larger community, either online or they're talking with their friends about the game that they played later. But, if you think about multiplayer games in particular, there are spaces where, you can either play with friends, people that sometimes you're matched up with strangers, you can get to know people that you might not have otherwise. You have this shared interest in the space, and we were joking at lunch about games like World of Warcraft, other games like that, where sometimes you would log on to play and you end up just chatting with your friends the whole time. So it becomes this sort of expensive chat system.
Yeah, the other thing about games that makes them very social is that they're mysterious. They're complicated to play. They don't explain how to play them, and you have to learn how to play them. And the way you learn how to play them is by talking to other people. So, I first sort of encountered this. My first video games were like, boy, this is going to date me, the arcades on Yonge Street in Toronto back in the 1980s. So you would show up, and there's like, you want to play asteroids, but there's only one asteroid cabinet, and there's 6 kids that want to play. So, 5 of you would just watch one kid play for 50 minutes, but you would talk to the other kids, and you'd observe what's happening on screen, and that's sort of how we learned how to play the game, by communing sharing knowledge amongst, arcades were social networks, basically. And the things you talked about were video games. And that, when the internet came along in the 90s, that started happening again. Like, I would be playing a game, I couldn't figure it out, I would go online, I would find the discussion board. Now I'm talking to people in, Russia and Texas about the game. And I just recently wrapped up a bunch of research into Minecraft, where I was hanging out, with like kids in grade, 3 and 4 and 5, and I'd be just watching them for 2 hours while they played the game. And there's, it's in one respect, it's one of these things that strike fear into the hearts of parents. 5 kids in a room all playing Minecraft, looking at their screens, right? Shouldn't you be interacting with each other? But if you listen to the audio, it's 2 hours of non-stop chatter. because they're constantly talking about what they're doing, or come on over here, let's collaborate on this thing. How do you do this? What's the formula for this thing? So the sociality around games is enormous.
And is that a legitimate form of community? Because we talk about, we've lost touch with our community and such. Are virtual communities legitimate?
Oh, yeah. The older women that I studied, there was this online game called Faunosphere, You Raised Pets, and it mostly appealed to older adult women, so from 40 up to like in their 70s. And when we interviewed them, for a lot of them, they would say, this is my time for me, but I enjoy speaking with, like my friends in the game. Like some of them would say, like, I can't get out as much anymore. I have limited mobility, and so this is a space where I can have a community. And it was a really meaningful space for them, such that actually they had this huge gripe because the game it launched on the web, and then it moved to Facebook, and the Facebook players invaded, and they hated it, and they talked about these horrible children, and so like any thoughts I had that these women would be maternal, no, they were just like these horrible kids, and like the names they called them were just incredible.
But that challenges a lot of stereotypes.
Yeah.
The notion of older women playing games online.
Oh, totally. Like I said, they spent a lot of money. Even if they didn't have any experience before playing games, they kind of banded together to figure out how to play. They created websites and, Excel spreadsheets about like the most optimal ways to play. They created their own activities within the game. Some of them, the early beta testers, they felt such expertise that they were advising the company like, no, you're launching too soon, it's not ready. So, it was really incredible to see them take ownership of this. Some of them said they had to upgrade their computers so they could play, and so they became experts in that. And so it was really this interesting space that totally upended those stereotypes.
Isn't that something everyone dreads, their mom being online with them?
Well, Mom didn't want them to be online with them, so.
Fair is fair.
Yeah, it was their time.
Now, Clive, talking about aging demographic makes me think about a piece that you wrote for Wired that was quite interesting about this whole notion about can we stave off dementia, with games. That whole industry is on a shaky foundation, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah.
Is there any real evidence that this can
Very,
good for your
very
brain?
little. There is an enormous amount of snake oil being sold online with these ideas that games can, it can prevent mental decline. When they study them, what they find is that, if you play one of these, like, sharpen your brain games, you get better at playing that game, but it doesn't. There's nothing. What they're looking for is what they call transfer. Does it transfer over into everyday life? If you're good at a memory game, you might get better at playing the memory game, but can you remember better where you left your keys? No, there's no transfer. So generally, those games don't seem to cause any harm. If you want to play them, that's fine, but they don't actually improve your life. Now, the one thing that's really interesting, though, along the lines of what Mia was talking about with these older women that were playing the games, is that what some studies have found, they produce good social capital, which is to say that when some older folks have been in group homes or whatever, started playing an online game with their family or with a member, could be Words with Friends, could be whatever, it reignited their social contact with their family and friends, and social contact is enormously salutary for older folks. In fact, what little we know about mental decline suggests that talking to people, whether it's on the voice or chatting, whatever, is great.
Yeah. When I was studying Facebook games back in the days of Castleville and Farmville, we were looking at how families played these types of games together, especially if they weren't in the same household. And people would tell us these stories about, well, it's a way for me to check in on grandma, like she enjoys playing the game and I play the game,
right.
And so we can see what she's doing day to day. Or it's also a way to talk with people that you wouldn't, like family members you wouldn't necessarily call on the phone, like your nephew or something.
That's right.
Like you wouldn't call your 12-year-old nephew to say like, hey, what's up? But you might play the same game and then you can chat, or text about the game. So it gives you something to talk about.
Yeah, so you can have a conversation, but it fills the spaces in the conversation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
But back to this notion, things like luminosity. Luminosity got whacked recently, had to pay a big fine because there's no evidence that it worked. Is there any evidence that games make you smarter? Or, you talked about they don't stave off dementia, but do they make you smarter?
That's an interesting question. I don't I've seen, there are some studies that look at things like quickness of response and whatnot, and there seems to be some indication that it can sometimes help improve attention, for example, counterintuitively. To play a lot of first-person shooters, you get really good at deploying your attention. So you actually, instead of making you jumpier, you're better at focusing. And there's been games they've tried to make games, educational games, to teach you math and whatnot. I've always been slightly suspicious of those, partly because, once again, whenever someone tries to make a game for a specific social good, usually the game is dull as dishwater. But more importantly, there's this idea that games are inherently depraved, and the only way to rescue them is to make them somehow educational or to have some social good. Someone once asked me about this, and I said, sometimes I think we've been so hijacked by the whole sort of Ben Franklin idea that everything must be industrious and towards a good thing every day. There's an extent to which sometimes I think what is joyful about games is that they completely break the Puritan idea that your time must be productively spent. And I mean games, I mean everything from kickball to solitaire to an online game. I think one of the things that makes them weirdly fun and seditious in our modern world is that they're a moment when you're saying, no, I'm actually not going to be ridiculously productive all day long. I'm going to play this game.
But there is still a push for that, right? Like we're pushing kids at school. If you're going to play a game, you have to learn the alphabet or whatever. Is that necessarily a bad thing?
You mean to learn to play a game that teaches you something?
Yeah.
Again, only insofar as those games tend to be dreadful. I mean, they are just the worst games I've ever played in my life. I mean, I've said that to my kids. We've downloaded these supposedly educational games, and it's unbelievably sad how badly they've been made.
People will play games on their own to learn things. I've had graduate students tell me, international students, they had their kids play games in English to help them learn English. I mean, the game was not designed to do that. But that was a side effect of doing it. But I think you're right. We want games to be good for something as a way to justify them. And I think with the educational system, there can be huge problems with the educational system. And basically, it's looked at every new technology as a way to save or improve the educational system. Television is going to help, learning explode, or, film's going to do that, and now it's video games are going to do that. And I think the problems are different and deeper than just, making a game that will suddenly, teach kids through fun.
Now, there is one thing that's really interesting that it's cropped up in research I've read and stuff I've seen, though, is that, games, the game itself may not have any quote-unquote educational import, but the game makes you do things that are unbelievably salutary. For example, I ran into this one. What happened? I was playing a game. I was playing the Star Wars game on my Nintendo DS, and I could not get past this one battle. So I did what anyone does. I go to look at a walkthrough online, right? So it's one of these things that explains, step by step. Here's how you fight this. I get to it. I'm like, and it's beautifully written. Sometimes these are a little not that well. It's really well written. So I get through the battle, and I decided at the end. I was reading. Who wrote this? I go to the bottom. There's the author, and thanking 10 or 20 people that helped him out. So I emailed him, and it turned out he was in, I think, grade 10 when he wrote this. I cut and pasted it and put it into Word, and it was, I think, 13 or 14,000 words long. Beautifully written, clear, crisp spec document. I said to him, what's the longest piece of text you've ever written in class? And he said, I guess about 2 pages, 500 words thereabouts. So because he was interested in sharing his knowledge about this game, and it was he wrote the first couple first bit of it, and other people were egging him. This is great, dude. Write more, write more. So he had this audience, impelling him to externalize his knowledge. So this was a fantastic spec document. This is better than stuff that the spec document that you would want someone in Boeing to be referring to when they're fixing an engine. And he did it because he was playing this game. And this happens over and over and over again. The real intellectual action, if you want to think about what makes games educational, happens on the periphery outside the game.
So did you feel like you were cheating when you used that walkthrough?
No. What I felt like is, and this is what I learned from reading your book. So Mia wrote a wonderful book about cheating in games, and one of the things this is perhaps the most wonderful bit of mansplaining. I'm going to tell you what your game said, your book said in front of these people. What I learned is that the majority of gamers, a lot of gamers, will try and play the game only until the point where they get frustrated, and that's when they'll go to the walkthrough. So to me, I regard walkthroughs as a moment when the game designer just fell down on the job and didn't make the game quite as good as they ought to, and it helped me get through. So I did not. But do you think people feel like they're cheating when they use things like that very much?
Some people do.
Yeah.
It depends on the person, and so I interviewed somebody once who said that anything outside of his own head was cheating.
Oh, interesting.
I said, like if you ask your brother or your sister, he's like, that's totally cheating.
Oh, really?
So
He's straight edge.
that's the purists, and then there are the people who, anything goes is fine.
Yeah.
And no matter what, though, like with the walkthroughs and stuff, even if people don't think it's cheating, they really don't want to use them because it takes away that joy of discovery and that sense of aha moment of figuring it out for yourself.
Yeah.
And how do you define cheating in games? Is it walkthroughs? Is it using the game not as intended? Is it cutting corners? What is cheating in video games?
That is the whole book.
Exactly.
But the
I want
only
you to
thing,
summarize it.
I didn't want to define it. I wanted players to define it for me. And the only commonality is cheating is anything that gives you an unfair advantage. And it can be in a single player or in a multiplayer game. You can totally cheat, according to some people, in a single player game that nobody else knows what you're doing. But then after that, it goes totally wide open. So using a walkthrough could be cheating, using a cheat code, using a bot or a hack, doing social engineering, trying to trick people out of their passwords or their money or whatever. So it really depends on the person. And it can also depend on the situation. For some people, there may be strict rules about cheating, like if they're in a competition, and they'll accept those rules, but then among their friends, it's totally different.
To me, what's interesting, the phrase there that's key is really unfair advantage, because clearly gamers understand that bending the rules is okay if everyone's doing it. And one of the things that was, when I was doing this Minecraft research, that was really interesting, and I've seen this over and over again with different games, is the players, if they're going to set up a game for themselves to play, will sort of what are going to be the rules of engagement here? Like, are we going to turn on invincibility? Are we going to turn on flying? Are we going to turn it off? And so they'll spend, I would watch kids spend half an hour discussing the rules for a game that would last for 5 minutes. And I thought that was wonderful because, this is one of the things that we like about games. And again, talking about games going from the game that kids figure out to play with a rock in a field to, a game like Minecraft, is that when we talk about, constructing a system of rules that we're all going to abide by, we're talking about sort of how to create civilization, right? Civilization is the rules that we all agree to abide by, and we're constantly tweaking them and figuring them out. And so this really, again, talking about the value of games, it's much bigger and deeper and more philosophical and weirder than this idea of what you learn from any individual game. It's that orientation towards rules and other people's and yourselves honoring them or dishonoring them.
Yeah, there was this great study, I forget the guy who did it. He tried City of Heroes, an online game, and he was going to play it. Basically, anything that was coded in the game that he could do, he would. And there are spaces that the players had sort of agreed, where you could attack anybody, but they had kind of agreed, these are social spaces, and nobody does that. He would go in and he would just attack people. And there were some things that people decided were unsporting. He would do those things. He was reviled. People couldn't stand him. And he's like, what? I'm just playing by the rules. But it was this whole sense of, even though a computer game, and that's like a difference where, the rules are coded in, there's this additional layer of social rules that players had created. And you can even see how this differs across cultures. Like when I used to play Final Fantasy Online, Japanese players had certain rules for social etiquette, and American players had different rules for how you're supposed to play.
Yeah, I remember back in the arcades when the first generation of sort of fighting games come along. So you put in your quarter and you're fighting with an opponent, and it's like sort of kung fu style fighting. And there's 3 rounds. If someone wins the first 2 rounds, the game's over, right? It doesn't go to the 3rd round. So what would happen is if someone won the first round, by convention they would let you win the 2nd round, so that you would have the fun of proceeding to the 3rd. And it was considered a massive violation of protocol if you killed person on the second. Seriously, there was real serious shade thrown in the arcade if you did that. I did it once by accident, and I had to leave.
Never live down the shame.
Never lived down that.
Can't go on Yonge Street anymore. But Mia, does cheating matter? It's just a game, right? Or does it carry over to real life? Do cheaters in video games become awful people in real life?
Well, I tried to ask people at first, if they thought that there was some connection, and all that meant was that everyone was like telling me how great a person they were. I never cheat, and it's totally different, and I can't see the connection at all. And I used to theorize that games kind of created this safe space for you where maybe you could try these things out. And in some way, I think it is true to an extent. Like you could try and bilk someone out of their money or try out this cheat code and see how it feels. And then you're like, oh, I feel like dirty. Or maybe I really like it, and that's awesome. But mostly people really, especially in multiplayer games, they did not want to cheat against other people. And it goes back to the games that I've been studying now that have lots of moral and ethical dilemmas. It's like people are sort of maybe rehearsing a sense of themselves and who they want to be. And for those types of people, they don't want to make those choices because that's not who they think they are. And there are some people who really delight in making those choices, and for them it is totally a different space. Maybe it's not. Maybe they're like that, but there are some people who can kind of set that partition, but for lots of people, they don't see it as very different.
It sounds like you have a community, and that community creates these cultural norms. Is that what's going on?
Well, there's definitely a community part of it, but you see it even with single-player games and games that no one knows what you did. I would talk with people who would say, "I didn't want Alistair to, dislike me," or "I wanted Leliana to be my friend." And this is an NPC, it's like, I didn't want her to be ashamed of me. I'm like, it's a digital game. But that's, they wanted to be a good friend. It was their vision of either themselves or what they wanted their character to be. No one else would know, but they could not break that contract.
Now, we've talked a lot about the benefits of games. They're fun, you build community, you make friends, you learn stuff, but there's some dark sides to them too. So I want to talk a bit about that. Every time there's a mass shooting in the US, we talk, oh, well, he played World of Warcraft incessantly or something. We always look for something to blame. Before it used to be music, now it's video games. Is there any truth to that? Playing violent games, does it make you more violent, or is it just people with a predisposition are drawn there? Do we know that stuff?
Do you want to start?
Well, you're the academic, so I've read the academic work, but
I don't do those types of studies. But first, to say that the shooter played video games is kind of like saying the shooter watched television. And they're so ubiquitous that it's, Michael Moore's documentary about bowling for Columbine pointed out, well, they went bowling that morning too, but we don't look at the bowling as an issue. And I think that video games being new are the scapegoat more often than not. There is a large amount of research. People try and prove effects. I don't see the long-term connections there.
I've been reading that research for a long time, and it's basically the consensus seems to be that no, games don't increase violence or even aggression except in a small, single-digit chunk of the population who already struggle with aggression. In that case, it can be significant for them, but for everyone else, it's not a problem. And in some respects, I think in a way that I understand why people are worried about the violence. I think we've almost sort of wound up talking about the wrong problem, though, because we've been so concerned with the idea that it could actually make a kid violent in reality, when there are other, to me, more troubling transfers happening. Like, for example, the gender roles in games, particularly those more realistic war games, tend to be absolutely bonkers. Like, the women are just crazily proportioned, scantily clothed in the middle of battle. The men are these, sort of ridiculously testosteronic, robots. And, whereas what the research seems to show is most kids are obviously pretty good at determining fantasy and reality when it comes to things like violence. You know, they know that killing someone in a game is one thing, but killing them in real life is the other. When it comes to things like gender in the real world is constructed so much upon performance and fantasy and things like that, that I sometimes think that's a much more pressing concern, is the crazy sort of loop that games like fashion, like images on TV can have in kids' sense of what constitutes, you know, normal and acceptable male and female behavior.
So let's talk a bit about the gender stuff, because that's important. It can be really difficult for girls and women online. There's a lot of cyberbullying, harassment, slut-shaming, you name it. Why does that exist?
It's the internet.
That's the fault of the internet. Oh.
Well, it's not just in games. I mean, it is.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
you can read the comments in the New York Times and find a lot of that there too. But I mean, part of it can be like in these spaces, if you don't know people and there's anonymity and there's no consequence for your action, that can certainly, you know, exacerbate the problem. You know, lots of women have said in online games, you know, they don't want to use voice because once they're outed as women, then they get more abuse. I mean, there have been websites like, what is it, Slutty or Ugly, where people can send in screenshots of, you know, the things that people have said to them simply because they were women. But it's just, I mean, it's getting more attention now, but it's definitely been ongoing. And, you know, some women have persisted in the spaces just because they want to play games so much. It has, you know, kept some away in the past. Some have started their own spaces, their own private servers, or they only play with friends. They have their own coping and managing strategies. Some companies, you know, are more proactive about it than others. And, but I think it's something that people are still just kind of struggling to deal with.
And Clive, I'm interested in that aspect. Is the industry or companies doing enough about this? My sense is there's a lot of, well, that happens in the real world, we can't do anything about it. Has enough been done to protect girls and women from this?
No, your sense is correct. They're absolutely not taking this seriously. A good example is Twitch. So Twitch is a website where, as a service where you can stream your gameplay for others to watch. And it's enormously popular. It's like the 4th largest streaming site on the planet. So people really enjoy watching other people play games, and it could be just a few friends, or it could be like 1 million people if you're a really famous streamer. But they have put nothing in place or very little in place anyway, or whatever is in place is certainly insufficient to deal with the sort of misogynistic abuse that the women streamers tend to face over and over and over again. So that's an example of a company that's falling down. And it really is, I mean, you ask why it happens. It happens because we live in a basically misogynist society where this is taught to young boys, right? And they grow up thinking this is a completely normal and appropriate way to address women online. So, you know, that's a problem that society has to wrestle with on its own, you know, separately, but there are lots more things that could be done with anti-abuse work at these games and sites online for sure.
But is this misogyny reinforced in games? You talked about how women are portrayed in games. Is that part of the problem?
Yes, but I mean, in the same way that it's reinforced in most movies and most pop culture in general. I mean, like I say it's a problem inside games. It's a problem inside pop culture overall. You know, it's not exempt from that problem.
Mm-hmm. And you have game studios, if they're, you know, 90% male, then they're not thinking about maybe the female audience or those considerations. They may think that they're joking around, the jokes become public, and then you know, there's backlash against them. I mean, other media companies may have similar problems, but I think with the game industry, it's especially exacerbated because it is so predominantly male in terms of like the development studios. That's a really central point, because until the industry itself actually has more women in the room designing the games, designing the systems, designing the interaction systems, it's really easy to not notice that stuff. And this is a problem with technological companies, Silicon Valley in general, but it's I've never actually seen has anyone ever did any numbers of women in the industry?
Yeah.
It used to be around 10%. I think it's gone up slightly.
Okay.
But I mean, and even that number, women were clustered in areas like HR, art and animation.
Marketing, yeah.
You know, marketing.
Yeah.
But even like this, going back to The Sims, when Will Wright had the idea for The Sims, it was designing houses. And I think it was another woman on the team who said, let's put people in there.
Oh, what a novel idea.
I know.
Who would have thought you'd need people in your video game? Yeah.
Now, I want to turn to the audience soon, but before I do that, I want to give you a chance to look into the future. Where's all this gaming stuff going? What's the future? Is it more virtual reality? Is it back to the future? Are we going to go back to Pong or whatever? Where's it going?
I get cranky about the future.
Go for it.
I'm really skeptical about VR. I tried an Oculus Rift when they were first, putting out the dev kits, and it's like this ViewMaster that's strapped to your face, and the screens are like, an inch from your eyeballs, and it hurts after about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And I was just exhausted, so I'm thinking, how could anybody play a game, for any length of time? It's even like, remember the Wii, you had the Wiimote that you were supposed to swing around, and people quickly figured out, you could just flick your wrist to get it to move. We can be incredibly lazy when we want to, so I just don't know, like with VR, if that's gonna be more than a niche. Maybe it'll be, a really interesting niche, but in terms of like broader popularity, what do you think?
I couldn't tell you. I think those observations are spot on. Then again, plenty of technology seemed bonkers at the outset, and became refined to the point where they got woven into everyday life. The first mobile phones are these ridiculous bricks that you couldn't imagine carrying around, and eventually that changed into something that's sort of indispensable to everyday life. So I think the thing to me that's really interesting with the future of games is that it's been interesting looking at younger players who I sort of interview, to learn what they're playing. And they are much more Catholic in their interests, which is to say, like, they don't make distinctions between older and newer games. So you show them, Donkey Kong from 1984, and they think it's awesome, in the same way that they think a game that was made last year is awesome. So there was this, video games they're a very young industry. It's like the film industry in the 1930s or something like that, where, but it grew up very quickly, and there was this sense that it was moving eschatologically towards, some sort of game, and I think in reality, what it's been really doing is creating a bunch of patterns of types of games that will continue to go on. So there will be people who will make VR games for sure, but there will be people who will continue to make games that look like Donkey Kong, because that turns out in the same way that there are still people writing sonnets. Hundreds of years after Petrarch sort of refined that, and Shakespeare refined the Elizabethan format. So I don't think those formats are going to die. I think new ones will be born, but what we see right now will continue on in some level.
And I think the tools, to make games have gotten simpler and simpler, and you see more people making games than ever before. And I mean, probably back at the origins of the industry, it was just amateurs at first, and now you see more people who, maybe if you want to make it as indies, but there are lots of people who make games as a hobby, as a way to express themselves. And I think it would be neat to say, like, instead of saying, like, I made this little Vine video for my friends, it's like, I made this little video game for my friends, or, it's your birthday, and so I made you this little game, that's just tailored to you. And I think, like, that's going to be an interesting thing, like, when games get more personal like that. Yeah,
and game authoring tools are becoming exactly like that, where the idea is I'm just going to, use this template, but customize it to make a fun little game for someone else. And that unlocks something quite interesting, right? Because we think of most media start off as broadcast media, which is to say they start off with it being really hard to do. So it's done by one person for an audience of millions, and that's the way the written word was and everything else was. And then eventually, at some point in time, and this has happened a lot in the last 20 years, it becomes suddenly a lot easier to do that. And then so everyone starts, making videos, or everyone starts writing a lot more, and we get this sort of Cambrian explosion of different reasons why you do it. So if video games become something that is really easy to do on a daily basis, you could imagine a bunch of, like, a much wider rhetorical range, like, the game that your mother leaves you to tell you to clean up your room when you wake up in the morning, right? Like you could imagine these things that are the equivalent of sort of almost the post-it note of a video game, to be experienced for 15 seconds to get the point and then never look at it again. That could get really, really interesting.
Interesting. So I'm going to invite people. There's a couple of mics around the room, and while the brave people, first people, are making their way to the mic, I'm going to ask you something I forgot to ask you at the outset, because what games do you play, both of you? And then just make your way to the mics, and they're going to bring up the house lights a bit so I can see you, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, over the break, I started Fallout 4. But I'm currently paused on it because the long games just, it's such a commitment. I feel like I need like hours and hours to sit down and play them. But before the break, I had finished up finally Dragon Age Inquisition, and also I really enjoyed Life is Strange. It was an episodic game, and the Game of Thrones game, because I like all things Game of Thrones.
Okay.
I've been playing a lot of Minecraft lately, and partly for social reasons. My kids play it, and so we play it together, and it becomes an enormously fun thing. We build things. We go on to one server, and we all build something. I play a lot of games on my phone because it's always there, and I was joking with me earlier that like I wish I were a more sophisticated gamer. I wish I were one of the people that likes these very slow-paced, complicated games. But I'm basically just a lizard brain gamer. I like driving things fast and shooting things and watching them blow up. So I've been playing Asphalt, which is a racing game on my phone. An embarrassing amount of time. Don't ask me to tell you.
You also have
how
the
much.
cat game.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah.
Yes, Katsumi. I've been collecting and cultivating little cats. It's a game where basically you I think this cut out of me, where you have to lay out trays of food to try and attract different cats. And you lay out the food, and you come back half an hour later, and you see what cats are there, and you take a picture of them. And eventually you try and collect all the cats.
He was grinding cats.
Yeah,
yes. Have you seen Framed?
Yes, I have Framed. I've played Framed.
It's awesome.
Framed is wonderful.
Yeah, it's this game you can play on your phone, and it's like cartoon panels. And you have a character, it's like a bank heist or something, and he's trying to get from point A to point B. There's a man, and then there's a woman, and you have to rearrange the frames in logical order for the person to get from the beginning to the end of each scene.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
I played all the way through about 3 months ago. Wonderful game.
Great. So we'll go to a question. I can't see too well, but I see there are a bunch of people standing up. So please ask questions, not soliloquies, so as we can get as many people in as possible. And there's the light. So I'll start on the left, and then I'll come here. Go ahead.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for your presentations and your discussions. Going back to the learning aspect of games, I was wondering if you're aware of or have done any research on problem solving. So learning either problem solving in itself or learning to persevere more and more as you play these games. So just, building up a resistance to tougher and tougher and tougher problems. Might that be something you can learn from games? It's a theory I have in my mind, and I'd like to get your input.
What do you think?
I haven't looked at the research on that. Maybe you have?
What you're talking about is sort of the classic modern conversation around grit and persistence, right? The short answer is no. I've never seen any good research into that. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just haven't seen it. The question would be, in a weird way, whether or not the sort of I talked earlier about how no one can tell if there's any transfer between a memory game and memory in real life. So is there any transfer between these almost philosophic orientation you take towards a game whereby I am going to do this until I get through and real life? I honestly don't know. I do know that just having gamed my whole life, I am surprised to find the philosophic echoes that I can see between games I've played and conundra I account in my everyday life, but I don't have any firm research. It's a great question.
So we'll go here.
About 50 years ago, a psychiatrist who had lost a lot of money on the stock market wrote a bestseller to regain his losses, and it was called Games People Play. It became an international bestseller. I don't know if you remember it or not. The basic premise there was that we're constantly playing games all the time in our daily activities, and that difficulties arise when people are using different sets of rules and they don't realize that that's what they're doing. So my question to you is, considering all the time and effort that takes place with so many people playing games, do you think that in some way their sense of reality has changed, that they look at the world differently than we used to years ago?
You've got them stumped.
That's a good one. It's a really good one. What do you think?
Do you speed more after your racing game?
Sometimes I once asked. I was talking to my friend Krishna. We were playing one of those fighting games in the arcades in Toronto, and we were all pumped up after having beaten each other up a bunch. And he observed afterwards. He said, I don't think I've become more aggressive overall, But if you bumped into me 5 minutes after playing the game, I might freak out. There's a temporary thing. See, that is a fantastic question. I mean, in one sense, here's why I'm going to say no. Because video games, in one sense, are not new at all. They're a continuity with, like, a millennia-old experiment we humans have had with playing games. I was in Sweden recently, and they have this ship that sunk in the 16th century, and they exhumed it and brought it up. And deep inside the ship, there are like these wonderfully articulated backgammon and chessboards that the poverty-stricken guys inside the ship had put together so they could play it on this long voyage. So we have been wrestling with chance, with each other, with ourselves, through games for thousands of years. And so I don't think necessarily video games are going to change that experiment we've had. And I think it's a good one overall.
Great, thanks. So we'll go over here on the left. Yeah.
Yeah. You more or less defined games as constructed systems of rules. But I feel like this definition is too narrow. Like, for example, you both mentioned good counterexamples, like The Sims or Minecraft. There's not really rules in both of those games, but they're still considered as games. So do you think this definition of games is too limited?
Mm-hmm. I teach a class on digital game theory and research to graduate students every year, and we usually do 1 week on definitions and like game and play especially. And by the end of the semester, somebody in some larger discussion will be like, but what is a game? And everyone goes, oh. Because it's this, no one can agree. And like Jesper Juhl actually, he wrote a book trying to define what a game is, and everybody argued with him because he dared to say that to be a game, it has to have a win condition, a win-lose, and so The Sims couldn't be a game. Mm-hmm. And some of us were like, no, but it's a game! And Will Wright has actually called it a software toy, so he's disavowing it. But, I mean, I'm still not sure what we get by, coming up with an ironclad definition, except by then like roping off some things as they don't count, and so they're lesser, and because we do end up attaching value, and we focus on certain things. Like we were talking before about sports video games, and these are huge, but lots of people don't study them. Game studies people don't really focus on them, even though they're like incredibly meaningful to people. Lots of games that maybe we don't define as games, like The Sims, other things like that, we end up not valuing them as much maybe if they're not defined. So I'm sort of against, I guess I didn't really want to define cheating. I also hate defining game because of then what we have to leave out. Maybe you feel differently.
Yeah, I would say that both Minecraft and The Sims have very, very, very complex and very strict rules. There's things you can't do, and there's lots of things you can't do in The Sims. Those are rules. I don't think there are any games that don't have rules, actually. That's the one thing you could say about them. I would definitely disagree with Jesper that you don't have to have a win condition for a game. But one of the delights I've had over years of being able to read game theory is the joy of these unending arguments. It's a great question.
Yeah, great. I would have follow-up questions, but like you said, it's a non-ending argument. So
thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Well, about definitions, I would like to come back on the one about games as rules that make it difficult to achieve goal. And if that is a game, what about the free-to-plays that we see come up in the last years? When we can see like constant achievements and all those visual effects and sounds that reward the player without any moment of real difficulty in it.
Right. Well, give me an example of one of the games you're talking about.
Like Facebook games,
sure,
social games.
Yeah.
Those the ones that are built on those mechanics that will make the player continue to play. Not just because it's difficult to achieve, but because I always have this feeling of winning. So what do you think? Is that still a game or not, actually?
Well, in some ways, those games aren't that different from online games like World of Warcraft, which you can't really win World of Warcraft and finish it. You can just stop playing it. But I would say that we like Facebook games, and I've looked at lots of Facebook games, and what they do is they reward different types of activities that I think traditional gamers don't value as much. Like we were talking about appointment gaming, like you have to keep showing up at the right times if you want to do well and advance. You have to know how long things will take and remember to go back because there can be penalties, associated with not going back at certain times. Like if you want your cats, you've got to make sure that you keep checking in to get those pictures of those cats. And so it's a different type of activity that you have to engage in as opposed to, like targeting enemies or something. So I think there can be different types of gameplay that they foster.
I mean, I'm a bit of a I'm a bit of a moralist about these games you're talking about. I think they're dreadful. I think that one of the things that is powerful about games, the idea of a game is setting up a system of rules and a goal that make it hard to get to, is that you're really, you're playing with fire. You're playing with some of the deepest human desires, and you can do that to make a game that's interesting and lead someone somewhere, or you can just use it to empty their wallet, which is what happens on these dreadful Facebook games. So my kids, they start playing games, and they quickly ran into these free-to-play games, which are just, terrible and evil for all sorts of reasons. But one of the main ones is, if the game is free, and then you work on it a little while, and then you hit something where you can't get past unless you pay them $2, and then it'll be another $3, another $4. Why this is even legal, I'm not even clear, because it strikes me as darn close to a scratch ticket lottery being marketed at 5-year-old children, right? But what this indicates, right, is that the sort of language of video games can be used to produce things that are culturally and emotionally and spiritually deep and interesting, and they can also just be used to empty out someone's wallet.
Okay. Yes, so go ahead.
Thank you.
Hi. So my question is about decision-making games and how, the psychological effects and the meaningfulness and how people, when they play the game, and how the emotions pour into the game, and how that will affect in the future, because many games now, like COD, are using these decisions in their making of games. So like Life is Strange and Walking Dead, they're the Walking Dead game. They're using these types of decisions that really stop you and get to think. So I'd like to know, what do you think the future of these games will be, and if it will be used in psychology or something?
Well, I know people who've been working on games that teach you to challenge, they challenge your cognitive biases. I don't know anything more about it than that, but people are doing that. In terms of those types of games, I mean, people play them for lots of different reasons, and they have different strategies. So there's people who will just, min-max everything and just make the most optimal choice that they think is available, or they role play. But lots of people also, they put themselves into these games, and what would I do? Or they create this character, and they're deeply invested. And so you hear these incredible stories about people who make a choice and then they feel so crappy about it that they have to stop playing the game, or they go back to an earlier save so that they can change their decision. And they talk about it being this really meaningful thing, and they can talk about something that happened to them a year or 2 or 3 or 5 years ago in incredible detail. So obviously it had some deep impact on them.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a really fantastic development in a lot of games, that they're taking the sort of the script writing aspect of it seriously, and taking the almost the moral purchase of a decision more seriously. It's one of the, I think, the more artistically daring and interesting things I'm seeing going on in games.
Great. So we're a little bit over time already, but I'm going to try and get in the last 3 questions if we can do them quickly. So go ahead.
All right. Hi. me and my husband, we really enjoy playing video games every day. And actually, he just started his career in video game design. So my question is, what aspects of video games today, consoles and PCs especially, would you like to see more of in the future?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a great one. Oh boy.
This might change something.
Pressure's
The
on.
chalice you placed in
Right.
our hands.
Well, the storytelling, the choices, and I like more of these episodic games, shorter games that you can play over a longer period of time. You get one, like Life is Strange, you get episode 1, then you have to wait a month. And it sort of recreates like water cooler TV, which you don't do anymore because you binge watch, all of that. But with these games, you can play through one episode, you can actually do it in 2 or 3 hours, and then you have to wait like a month, and you can talk about it with your friends.
Oh, okay, so like long-term games in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Kind of like how Dickens used to write his novels, right? He'd write a chapter.
Serialize them, yeah. Yeah, and serial's popular on the internet, sort of that kind of episodic. We talked about that earlier as a big thing.
I'd be interested in seeing more games that sort of require you to slow down.
What do you mean? Slow down how?
Well, Ian Bagost, who's an artist and a game designer, created a new Atari 2600 game, which takes some doing a few years ago, called A Slow Year. And it has 4 mini games that require you to pay very close attention to minute, small changes on the screen.
Oh.
And it's very meditative and interesting, and it strikes me as a game mechanic that has been underexplored.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
You have said that more people are spending more and more time playing games. Do you think that this will affect life achievement?
Life achievement?
I mean, like, people are spending more time in game, but they're like not doing their work. So
Most of the time, it's substituting for other screen time. So if they're playing more games, it's coming at the expense of TV or Facebook.
So we're not creating a generation of slackers.
Yeah, I think if we are far enough into the video game experiment of our society that if we were going to just drive straight off the Wile E. Coyote cliff, we would have noticed it already. Or perhaps we're in the point where you hover in the air before you realize you're going to fall. But no, I think we're probably fine. I think we can run the data on that one and say we're going to be okay. But it doesn't mean that games aren't going to evolve in new and interesting ways. I don't think what we have right now is all we're going to wind up with.
Okay, thank you. So one last question. Thank you.
So I kind of wanted to go back to the question about choices and more importantly about accountability that some of the games sometimes bring up. I'm talking about the Stanley Parable, Beginner's Guide, and more recently Undertale. How you load back a save file and the game sort of says, "Oh, but I know what you did." How do you feel like that affects not only gamers but also the future of games and game design? Is this something that we're going to see more of, or that we would like to see more of, or?
Oh yes, I mean, I've been lectured to about how I have to go play Undertale, and it's like a true believer kind of thing. And I tried it, and at first it didn't grip me, but now I'm afraid to because of the save file that I created. But every time one of these designers comes up with these awesome ideas, I would also add a game like Papers, Please, where you're a border agent, introduces some wonderful ideas into the mix. It just gives, more license to people to say, oh wow, I never thought of doing anything like that with a game. And we get a little further away from just another game about shooting things or, chasing dragons, which I like, but I think that there's lots more material to explore. And so those games are really opening people's eyes to oh wow, these new possibilities.
Yeah, exactly. The thing that's interesting with those games is that they're all using game mechanics that we've sort of figured out over time, and but using them for something that is just a very different cultural experience than a typical game. People call them artistic games, whatever it is. I mean, that sort of gets you into this weird discussion of whether games are art, which I don't find that interesting. They are certainly artistic. But what I like, and we talked about this earlier, what I think those games presage is that because game making tools are becoming a little more widespread, and because you can make and distribute a game for not much money or for free, it really breaks open the rhetorical power of games. They can be made not just to sort of make you money or get enough people addicted that they will pay for it, but to sort of make an argument or to express a single emotion or something like that. And to me, this is really this is what I find the most interesting part of games, is the idea that they might break open in rhetorical force and rhetorical purpose to be used for things that we can't even imagine years from now.
Yeah. And you also add to that people who maybe didn't grow up playing all of those types of games or just aren't locked into those genres.
That's right.
Different types of people coming in and now can make these games, and so they are bringing their own experiences and their own ideas. And if they're not, fans of particular genres, or they have no preconceived ideas of what it should be, they may come up with like wonderfully different ideas.
Yes. Yes.
So I want to thank you, the audience, for being here tonight and for your really great and rich questions. They were really a great question period. And especially our two guests, Mia Consalvo and Clive Thompson, for thinking out loud.